All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Rayner. I am the Restoration and Volunteer Manager for the Watershed Project, and I am joined today by Obi Kaufmann. Obi is a naturalist, writer, and illustrator. He is the author of the California Field Atlas, a guide to the state's ecology, natural history, and geography. And his books feature watercolor paintings of maps, wildlife, nature, and musings on the natural world and our place in it. He is most famous for the California Field Atlas, and then all of the corresponding books in that series, The Deserts of California, Forests of California, Coasts of California, and upcoming The State of Fire, a look at fire in California. Obi, is that a good intro? Is there anything else you'd like to add to that before we dive into the conversation?
Well, uh, thank you, Ethan. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. Is my audio quality okay?
It sounds
Okay,
great.
good, good, good. Okay, let's just put those books in chronological order because you really because that's the storied manner in which I approached the subject matter, the ecological context of California, is very important to understand in order to go forward. Started with the California Field Atlas with an overview of earth, air, fire, and water, and how these immense living systems interact with the California floristic province and beyond that, the deserts of California, in how they inform biodiversity and biogeography across the state, and that's really the subject that launched the rest of my work. I then went to the state of water, understanding California's most precious resource, because I had to understand exactly how water infrastructure transformed the waterscape of California in terms of its storage, its conveyance, and its usage in the human world in order to get back to the natural world of California, if you will, which I encapsulated in the California Lands trilogy that you alluded to. First, with the forests of California, which really describes the evolutionary past of arboreal habitat across the state. And the second book was the coasts of California, which is really a snapshot of our ecological present, if you will. And then finally the deserts of California, which is sort of obliquely a description of what can be the future of California ecology, given climate breakdown by way of anthropogenic global warming and increased aridity, increased development, and all these stress vectors really that are influencing what will be the quality of our future human residence here. And all that culminates now into my final book, the sixth book, which will be coming out in September, which is The State of Fire, understanding how, where, and why California burns, which is really a book I've been waiting my whole life
Hmm.
to write. And I can't wait to share it with you all. That will be here in the fall of 2024 through Heyday Books in Berkeley.
Cool. Thank you for that
Yeah,
explanation and deep dive. I
thank
have
you.
several of your books on my shelves. I know the state of water specifically. I studied water policy in school, and it was instructive and very,
Mm.
very illustrating of our natural and unnatural waterscapes that have shaped both historical and then current environments we live in today. And I know most of my naturalist friends. I don't know a California naturalist who doesn't have at least one of your books on their bookshelves. So yeah, thank you
Well,
for
thank you,
your
thank you. Yeah,
contributions.
the state of water is such a specific book, and I think the reason why that book worked is because it is so specific, right? It's really about those three things that I mentioned, which is storage, right? So it's got this sort of like additive math property to it, just sort of adding up all the reservoirs,
Mhm.
if you will, and then the conveyance, how we move water around the state, which rivals I argue anything that humans have done with anything, anywhere, at any time, right? So it's like what Californians have done with water is just completely remarkable
Mhm.
at any scale. And then of course usage. Where is all that water going inside of our human ecology? And I don't get much into say um, policy. I don't get that much into money, and I don't get that much into water rights. And I think maybe counterintuitively, I don't. as far as a book that's really concerns itself with ecology goes, I don't get that much into groundwater and how and subsidence in the Central Valley and that kind of thing, and I don't get that much into sea level rise. So this is really about freshwater ecosystems, which is the vocation that I am most interested in.
Absolutely. Wow, you're speaking my language there. I could talk about groundwater policy. I'm from the Central Valley, and that's all very, very important there. But I digress. We'll save that for a different time. So I'd like to start off before we dive into the actual project that you helped the Watershed Project work on. I'd like to start off with introductions by asking what watershed you currently live in and what is meaningful to you about it.
Oh yeah. Well, I am an East Bay kid. I am. Um, I'm in your watershed. We're just talking about the border of Alameda and Contra Costa County here. On the traditional lands of the Lejeune Confederacy, the Hujon people. I just moved from Carquinez, which would be the Carquin people. I live back in Oakland. I bring up these uh, we also have to would talk about the Chichenyo families that are still very much active in our local community here. What we're I bring up these endonyms, right? And an endonym is something that the people call themselves, as opposed to an ethnonym, which would be something that's imposed on them. You usually hear of like the Ohlone people, for example. The Ohlone people never existed, right? It's about uh, 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 ethnography and how that influences uh, historical um, truths that or how it obfuscates historical truths about very much people still alive dealing with the trauma of what has been this trifecta of attempted genocide, erasure, and enslavement over the past several hundred years. And yet, the miracle of this, and the miracle of, in fact, the current biodiversity profile in the Bay Area and beyond into California, is that although every single one of our natural landscape types, just like every single one of our the native peoples of California have been so assaulted and injured over the past several hundred years that there is an endangered quality to all of it, and yet all of it still exists. We have a very low extinction rate in the state. In fact, our extinction rate is less than 1%. And so there's this miracle to be stewarded here. And I think that as we go forward into the 21st century and we're realizing the difference, for example, even just the difference between an ethnonym and an endonym of the native peoples of California who have been stewarding this land for thousands and thousands of years. We have now this opportunity, this window to usher the miracle forward through this continuance of stewardship towards something like a great vision, which would be leaving the natural state of California in better shape at the end of the 21st century than we left it at the end of the 20th century. Say, how about that for a bit of hope? You know,
Absolutely.
we can get into details. And I think the Watershed Project's Living Levee
Mhm.
is a fantastic example of this kind of hope written in policy, hope written on the landscape, hope written across the hearts of the citizenry that is activated by this calling to be ever more from this place. What does it mean to be from this place? That's a question that is laced across every word that I write, every painting that I make. Like I'm always asking myself, what does it mean to be from here? And when do I get to finally do it? I'm not looking for some kind of destination where it's like I finally get to be from here. No, no. It's a process of sense making. It's a
Mhm.
process of reconciliation. It's a process of communication. It's a process of justice reckoning that I hope and aim to be working at every day.
Oh, wow. Yeah, definitely. That was very powerful. Thank you. I mean,
Thank you.
that including I mean, touching on just indigenous connections to the land. I work in habitat restoration, and we cannot disassociate native plants from indigenous peoples and from native peoples. I know for this project and in other projects that the Watershed Project is based out of, especially here in Richmond, we work
Mm.
closely with the Confederated Villages of Lishan to, bring the power of place back to all that we do and work here. But speaking of that, and living here, and then you also mentioned that you're an East Bay boy. How long have you lived in California? And then I'm curious about your overall trajectory that led you to where you are today, specifically like the path that led you to your current role as naturalist and illustrator,
Yeah.
defining and just really having dialogue with some of California's most quintessential habitats and plants and wildlands.
Well, thank you for the question, Ethan. Yeah, I mean, I lived in California my whole life. I was born in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard. My father was the director of the Griffith Observatory and astrophysicist, and my mother was a clinical psychologist, right? So I had this real fun dynamic between having these two rigorously intellectual, albeit scientific forces in my life. And for most of my life, Dr. Kaufmann's son was going to be a mathematician, so I have as much training in math as I do in anything else. And yet, of course, the resultant stone from all that applied pressure that is me would identify as an artist above all else. It's my first calling. It'll probably be my last, even though what an artist is often dabbles in this quality of storytelling that is like something like a journalist or a policy communicator or a science communicator in that way, unveiling the truth in a narrative form from all of these other sources within my larger community, right?
Mm,
And so now that journey continues, for example, in this ongoing conversation that I'm having with the chairman of the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria, Greg Saris, who is an author as well and a professor of literature. We sit down every month to discuss such things in a podcast called Place and Purpose. So maybe your listeners
cool.
can catch up with us there as we discuss, as I said, what it means to be from a place. So yeah, Southern California, Northern California, went to school at UC Santa Barbara, back to the East Bay. Mount Diablo is where I cut my teeth as a young naturalist, and where I always go to return to my mountain home,
Mm,
home mountain. It's all there. What a beautiful gem that is
absolutely.
of wilderness. Ensconced as it is
Mhm.
in this suburban environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Mount Diablo is quite beautiful. I recently was transplanted here to the East Bay after living in the Bay Area for a few years and just had the wonderful opportunity to go to Mount Diablo for the first time a few years ago and just see it in full splendor in the spring, and all the unique and wonderful wildflowers there is really it's something else. It's something to be cherished, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, indeed, indeed. There's this really great, yeah, Ethan. We met at the California
Mhm,
Naturalist conference a couple of years back, and I was just interviewed by Michelle Fulner, who runs a podcast called
mhm.
California, the Golden State Naturalist, and she and I walked all around
Cool.
in exactly the environment you're describing, sort of as if we were bees with our apiary cousin, exploring one wildflower to the next and discussing what indigenous botanical regimes mean to the
Mm,
current and future ecological character of California. And Mount Diablo is such a beautiful place. It sticks out like a thumb
mhm,
into the Central Valley, catching all the seeds from the Northwest and the seeds from the Southwest as well. From the temperate rainforest to the desert environments, and so you get these springtime vernal blooms that
mhm.
occur nowhere else in the floristic province. It's an impressive place by any measure.
Absolutely. I can't wait to go back there in the coming weeks. I mean, we're what, the first day of February right about now. So now all the early season wildflowers are starting to pop up, the special
Yes.
woodland ones, and then from there it's go time. But again, I want to be respectful of your time, so I should dive in. I could talk to you for hours, it seems. But I want to dive into the project at hand and mention a little bit about the Living Levee project that you so kindly did the signs for. So the Living Levee is a project on the Richmond shoreline that is set to address the significant impacts of sea level rise in the coming decades that'll pose huge risks to existing infrastructure, impacted communities, and also natural wetlands here in the Richmond area. And so, after many decades of planning and community activism, a solution was to shape this land and build a living levee along the North Richmond shoreline. This would be a low-lying, broad structure that would be built parallel to the shoreline to protect it from coastal flooding, and then also wave erosion by using native plants and other nature-based solutions to mimic the natural landscape and prevent erosion. So this will also not just provide valuable habitat for birds and all sorts of native species as well, but this would also create opportunities for community members to connect with nature by creating walking and biking trails, parks, and play areas, and have areas for the community to really come close and experience nature while protecting our shoreline. So this project is still in the planning phases. The design is going to be launched soon, and if funding is granted, then implementation can begin as soon as 2025. So I want to ask you a bit more about your hand in the project. I have some of your signs here that you designed for us. This probably won't go well over Zoom, but we'll post it in the newsletter. We have a series of 3 signs having the past, so showing condors, bears, all sorts of other really cool. Folks can definitely dive into this much more closely than I can show. Also showing the present, showing the environmental degradation, showing the Chevron refinery, and then sea level rise and land use here specifically, which I think is a really cool illustration that the Zoom does no justice towards. And then also the future that shows some of your really detailed illustrations with Grindelia, and other plants and animals, salmonids as well, that would really benefit from this project as well. So we'll post those images, and then also hopefully have you have a nice little in-person gathering to unveil those signs when they actually finally go in the ground in the coming months. But so about this project, I'm curious why you wanted to do it, and what did you learn from this project specifically?
I'm so pleased and honored, thrilled, in fact, to be a one of the many storytellers, front-facing storytellers, if you will. These are interpretive signs that will be publicly displayed in a semi-permanent manner for the time being, at least through the construction of the project, after which they'll probably be archived. Like so much of my work these days, it's about connectivity. It's about connectivity not just in space and time through habitat spaces, but between members of our own species, trusting each other with a story being told. So now we've got connectivity not through space, but also through time, as you were saying. The past, the present, and the future, as this particular project is framed temporally. The past does equal future. Future does equal past uh, in a parameter that might exist in a well stewarded ecosystem or systems of ecosystems like we have here on our precious northwest coast of Contra Costa County. We've got something here in the levee that is a particular type of infrastructure that we're seeing going up or coming down across the state as we're waking up to new paradigms of continuance and resiliency that certain vectors of the natural environment offer to us free of charge, like uh, biodiversity and its ancillary ecological services. I was also the artist this year for. By way of example, I was the artist this year for the National Wildlife Foundation and the building of the Wallace Annenberg Wildlife Bridge across Highway 101, down in Southern California near Thousand Oaks that connects the Simi Hills to the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. It's the largest wildlife bridge in the world, spanning 10 lanes of freeway. And it is by this one piece of infrastructure that it's predicted the genetic biodiversity of the Southern California population of mountain lions will be preserved. Saving the species itself perhaps from extinction by one piece of infrastructure. I'm also involved with California Trout and freetheeel.org, which is now involved in the removal. I think Gavin Newsom this week, as a matter of fact, was up on site, the removal of two deadbeat dams on the northern Eel River that will be coming down in the next year or two, freeing up hundreds of square miles of salmonid spawning habitat space in the watersheds of that incredibly dynamic river. So the living levee is another piece of this interesting um, uh, coalition of infrastructure pieces that are designed to address issues of um, dwindling biodiversity, or as ecologists call it, simplification, uh, in the air in the coming century, that together represent a bottleneck, if you will, uh, that we are very much in right now. To address this bottleneck, these inflection points that we've gone through and are coming out of, how do we successfully navigate through this incredibly stressed period of time towards a future of greater abundancy? And I see in the engineering solutions, and you've got to remember that most of these problems that we're facing are technical. Okay, so we got into this predicament uh, by uh, decisions that we made. I don't mean to use the word "we" so flippantly, but the decisions that were made to uh, expedite a kind of industrial fundamentalism, if you will. And now that we're seeing in the 21st century a new paradigm that eschews false choices where we have to, where we thought, where um, where before it might have been thought that we had to choose the environment or economic growth, say. Now we're finding that we can have both. We can have a future of great abundancy. And it requires, as I mentioned earlier, tending to this miracle that we still have, this representation in both a diverse human community and a diverse more than human community, if you will,
Hmm.
that needs to be protected, conserved, and celebrated for future generations to come.
Absolutely. And I think what you mentioned about like the false dichotomy of sacrificing nature for the sake of progress or industry is definitely changing. And that's something that the Watershed Project specifically focuses on, both with this Living Levee project, but then also just our green infrastructure projects throughout Richmond and the East Bay here to create rain gardens, habitat gardens, rainwater capture systems. There's this one really cool bioswale that we have as kind of a test case that was built in 2008 by a community center that it drains part of a parking lot and part of a road that normally would go directly into a creek, but it drains into this bioswale that filters out up to between 60 to 90% of pollutants, heavy metals, oil, microplastic as well before it goes into the creek and goes into the bay eventually. And so that's a really cool instance to show folks how we can incorporate nature, not just for the sake of biodiversity, which is awesome and I'm all about, but how to make our landscapes more permeable, it can more green and more healthy into the future. So that is definitely something that is of interest to us at the Watershed Project, and sharing that with others is really important. So
Fantastic.
all these nature-based solutions are where it's at into the future. I really like what
All
you
right.
mentioned as well about connectivity, both in landscapes, but then also in time. Um, would you be willing to touch a little bit about that, both within this project and then also uh, with like other projects generally, how you try to connect all those things together, both place-based and then also just time.
Sure. Well, the study of ecology is difficult because of its complexity. And a lot of that complexity arises from temporal issues. Uh, there are physical sciences like physics and chemistry that exist outside of the realm of time. And I mentioned earlier that I was trained in mathematics. Math is easy. It's very logical. When you're dealing with ecology, when you're dealing with biological systems in relationship, you're dealing with a matrix of variables across a dancing terrain that is that makes things like disciplines like rocket science appear simple by comparison, right?
Mhm.
So right now we're in a moment where we're drawn to words like restoration. But as the author David Rains Wallace once said, restoration is kind of like the promise of restoration would be like playing a film of an explosion in reverse somehow, right? There are so many pieces, biotic and abiotic pieces of, and by that I mean living and non-living, uh, pieces of the puzzle that are simply removed from the board at this point. So, what does restoration look like with the pieces that we have left? That is something to be um, that is something to be worked out. That is something to be discussed in good faith with all involved. These resources towards uh, um, a resiliency that we know is extant in the past. You look towards the past. You look towards the past. Let's say over the climate history of California across, the Holocene, across the past 12,000 years. We see mega droughts that lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet throughout those mega droughts, we California retained all of its complement of biodiversity, didn't lose a single species. And what were then that architecture of resiliency? Well, it has a lot to do with quantifying and qualifying these biotic and abiotic factors within this grander system. So, if we can um, engineer systems that keep the pieces on the board, right? We are making a bridge from now to the future that is not further degraded. And in fact, as we make this bridge to the future, we're also simultaneously and counterintuitively reaching towards the past, as if time itself is not a line, but a circle, the shape of the horizon, which indeed might lend itself to a contemporary physical understanding of something like the space-time continuum, where space and time are the same thing. By protecting the space, you protect the future, which is something that makes intuitive sense, although parsing that out into something other than rhetoric, parsing that out and delegating that to something like policy is the realm of uh, I don't know, even perhaps better storytellers than myself.
Definitely. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there has been the paradigm shift of having, in the past of history being linear to being circular. And I think that is really illustrated well in these sign projects as well, illustrating how the past impacts the present and the present impacts the future, but then the present and future can impact the past and preserving what we have to benefit future generations, to preserve biodiversity, preserve habitat as much as possible for the future generations moving forward. I think that's very powerful.
Right. And I don't want to, Ethan, I think it's very important to not deny certain political realities that exist. Given the divisiveness of so much inside the mediosphere and the technosphere that we encounter and attempt to regulate every day. When we talk about huge paradigm shifts, and we're talking about complex systems, we're talking about emergence of what will happen in terms of applied prescription, right? I don't mean to sit here righteously and say that it is going to go one way or another, because I am a firm believer in a democratic process, right? And if we don't have that, we can't there can be no slippage towards something like, some sort of eco-fascist regime, because that certainly will not work either. We have to incorporate so many different epistemologies, so many different, world truths, world stories about how, people exist in their own daily lives. And I think that the road forward to that place is not through making a better argument. I'm not here making a better argument, but it's about telling a better story. I think that's the only thing that's changed anybody's minds ever. And working at that story together in this democratic context, at least as much as we can hope for in some sort of ideal situation, is the best bet.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That is very powerful and very true. I want to pull us back a little bit more to just focus on a couple more questions about this project and then also
Okay.
general like place-based projects. So, what is your process for thinking about and working on projects like this that are so focused on a specific place? I know there's several illustrations, both maps, but then also you can see here. Yes, you can see here the different refineries and the skyline pictures from specific marshes. So yeah, that does not that does not correlate very well with showing it on Zoom, but folks will be able to see that. So how does that inform your process, and what does that entail? Like, do you go out to the field for certain projects like this? I'm very curious.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of walking. There's so much pedestrianism in my work. You can't get it by driving. You can't get it by flying over. You gotta get out there into the field. You gotta smell the thing. And you know that it's a beautiful place that's almost crying out for uh, remediation
Hmm.
and some sort of membrane, which I think the living levee represents, right? This membrane, as you were talking about the bioswale phenomena, how the functionality of that specific piece of infrastructure helps the chemical and physical makeup of the larger ecosystem. And then there's this other subtle aesthetic quality. You think of it as like salmon singing, that by way of their own anadromous life cycle, the salmonids that begin their life in freshwater make their way to the marine environment where they mature over several years, only to come back and deposit their mortal body and remains in the very same waters where they were born. And the fact that these population of fish that were so primary in so many indigenous food regimes, as far as food sovereignty goes. I mean, there was just so plentiful. The fact that California, as a political entity over the past 170 years, has chosen to completely shut that down and has done a very poor job at that particular aspect of ecocide. Although we're pretty horrified at there's no laurels to rest on here, but all of the evolutionary significant units of California's fish, anadromous fish, are still extant. So if there is time, there is hope, right? If there is time, there is hope. Hope. Getting back to that temporal idea too. So like even establishing uh, freshwater environments across the Bay Delta system, which are so necessary for young salmon on their way out to the sea to get a little bit of rest from predators and water water divergences in California water infrastructure that are, we've got some big problems going on there from Sacramento with the water conveyance plan, for example. But what we've got is little moments like this in our habitat, our community habitat, which can represent the difference between life and extinction. And the living levee is a marquee example of the kind of project that we could use more of, but at this point should be grateful to be on the way to existing at all.
Agreed. Most definitely. I wanted to touch on something you said earlier was about, you're walking these beautiful landscapes and they're basically just like crying out for remediation. Um, Richmond, the city of Richmond has some of the most mileage of bayshore trails in within the bay, and it's really amazing to have all of these landscapes and beautiful skylines and mudflats and everything to walk on. And our office is actually just right off of the bay shore, and so we can walk from our office and see the skyline and walk along the mud flats and see all these cool native plants and everything. And that really speaks to me when we are doing restoration and remediation in areas like these. I'm kind of reminded of a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer about, paraphrasing here, but tending the landscape is an act of love. Restoration is an act of love, and in so doing, it's a constant act of caring and also hope for the landscape. Like I tell our volunteers and our community members when we do habitat in urban restoration of planting and tending to native plants, like it's not just a one and done activity. It's something that you have to care for. You have to come back because native plants will thrive if you give them the chance, but you have to tend them and get them established. I can see from my window, I can see toyon and all sorts of native plants and wonderful berry producing plants that are incredibly important for the habitat, and they grow in the marsh and they're super resistant. And if we let them grow and thrive, they will. And so this project, the Living Levee, incorporating native plants to be I mean, I know the term nature-based solution is a little bit of a buzzword now, but bringing nature in is the way I believe that we can preserve what we have and make it better.
Yeah, my only problem with nature-based solution is, what is nature?
Mm.
Nature doesn't exist in California. It's been stewarded by hundreds of thousands of people for tens of thousands of years. It's the whole configuration of habitat space across California has been determined by people.
Mhm.
And all of the infrastructure projects that I'm built in are nature-based solutions. Yeah, sure, get out of the way of the natural processes, but how do we augment them through engineering? So we have this incredibly powerful overlap between traditional ecological knowledges of indigenous people with scientific innovation.
Mhm.
That I think is our best tool going forward.
Absolutely. And that actually ties really nicely into one of my final questions. So I
Sure.
know that you have done significant amounts of research for your upcoming book, The State of Fire, and that dives into the history of land use and indigenous cultural practices around the use of fire as well. How do you go
Yes.
about writing and illustrating topics like these? I know you mentioned, was it Greg Sardis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you
Sorry,
guys have
Saris. Yeah.
yeah, you guys have
Sarris. Yeah.
yeah. How do you go about writing books like these, like touching on these cultural practices?
Right. Well, I figure out my voice first, right? Who am I? Which is largely related to where am
Mm,
I? Who am I? Okay, so what is the nature of my vocation? What is the nature of my discipline? What is the nature of my practice? I am an artist. Okay, I need that license and I need that shield in order to go forward into these scientific and cultural matters, to uh, freely inquire, to gather the leaves of data left
Mm,
by the whether they be indigenous stories or their which would be ethnographic evidence, right?
mhm,
Or ecological science. I'm about to leave you here today and head on up to the University of California graduate program for ecological studies, where I'll be delivering the keynote tomorrow at their annual symposium.
mm,
Um, so I need as much data as I can get. All of my art is data driven,
mm,
right? So then once I have my voice figured out, okay, I I can then apply it however I see within this larger model of expression, and uh, always going back to the very basic questions, and also with heavily cited sources. I mean, you can see that the tremendous amount of um, you know real estate in the book, page covering
mm.
real estate in the books, are covered with endnote citations. I take data sources very seriously, and yet all the time I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm not writing textbooks.
Mm.
Okay, so like I'm not going to leave you alone with the data. That's one of the privileges I get as calling myself an artist. As evidenced by the hundreds of hand painted maps and wildlife renderings I have throughout the book, right? So I hope to walk the walk too, but I'm not going to leave you alone with the knowledge. What I'm going to do is invite you along on this discovery with me.
Mm.
And what I get to do at that point is start with sort of a carte blanche, right? A blank page that isn't beholden to a larger array of um, expectations, uh, and it makes for some startling conclusions about the nature of nature, the state of the state. So it is always an adventure. I could make 100 maps a day for the rest of my life and never tell the whole story of California. It is that deep. It is that beautiful. It's that rich. It's that diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just one final question, since we were talking about storytelling, I'm wondering if you have any foundational texts that were important to you and formed your own voice as a writer and like illustrator. I know like as we were talking about, all of the data points, all of the maps in the world are great, but without a voice and something to engage you and draw you in, it can be very dry. Like all all of the research and all of the research papers, without something, a narrative, can not really engage you. So I'm curious about any foundational texts for you personally.
Oh yeah, I got a stack of books right here.
Hmm.
I didn't know this question was coming, but I'm always ready for it. Richard Dawkins, The Extended Phenotype. He's probably best known these days for his books on the new atheism movement, including the God Delusion. But back in the day, in the '70s and '80s, he's a Oxford biologist, and he wrote The Selfish Gene, which invented the meme idea, and this was the sequel to The Selfish
Hmm.
Gene, which he always says that is his best book,
Hmm.
The Extended Phenotype. Like he's got a beaver on the cover
Yeah.
here. What does a beaver's dam do in its function as an ecological engineer? How does that influence the nature of genetic information across the globe? Here we have Berkeley's own Ursula Le Guin, Dancing at the Edge of the World, essays, thoughts on words, women, and places. This is a fantastic collection of essays that is so important. This is Robin Wall Kimmerer before Robin Wall
Hmm.
Kimmerer. This is Ursula Le Guin is one of our um, country's great literary treasures in terms of fiction, and this being her nonfiction. I've got Edward Wilson's
Hmm.
Consilience, The Unity of All Knowledge, which she wrote in the early '90s. Edward Wilson is famous for a huge amount of stuff, including the popularizing of the term biodiversity itself,
Mm.
and his groundbreaking book with the ecologist Robert MacArthur in 1968, which was the theory of island
Mm.
biogeography, was the first ecological working model we had of how speciation actually happens in a landscape, following up on Darwin's process. And I think lastly, I'll just leave you with uh, Lynn Margulis and
Mm.
Symbiotic Planet. Everybody should be able to know and name by heart at least how about um, how about five biologists who are popular in modern discourse? And why don't you make at least two of those biologists women?
Mm.
And Lynn Margulis is responsible for so many things, including working with James Lovelock to in the groundbreaking work regarding Gaia theory. But now her theory of endosymbiosis, which is the theory of why your mitochondrial DNA is different from every other DNA in your body, based on a genetic contract written between multiple organisms deep in the Proterozoic era,
Mm.
um, billions of years ago, um, is now what you find in high school textbooks. And
Mm.
how new the story is, how new the unfolding science is towards even our own bodies is tremendously exciting. And I think that, like, young people right now, uh, to be a scientist, or to be a young student of science at whatever age you are. I consider myself a young student of science. Come on. um the threshold of novelty that is present uh, is staggering. It's what we don't know dwarfs what we do, and it is the whole world is waiting for us.
Wow, well, that was a very comprehensive list. I'm looking forward to reviewing some of those and reading those myself. But Obi, I'm going to stop the recording, and then I just want to wrap up something with you. But then I wanted to thank you again for all of your time here, and I hope everyone who watches this enjoys the conversation as much as I did. So thank you very
Hey,
much.
thank you so much. That was great fun.
Of course.